Good morning. My name is Michael Keene, author and director of many historical documentaries that you may have seen on YouTube Premiere, such as Heart Island, Madhouse, Abandoned, The Psychic Highway, and Question of Sanity. Today, I would like to take the time to introduce you to my latest program, In Search of White Crows, The Strange and Tragic Lives of the Fox Sisters. As you're about to see, In Search of White Crows is somewhat different than my usual documentaries, as we use original artwork, animation, several voice actors, and a complete musical score. In Search of White Crows was fortunate enough to have won Best Picture at the Rochester International Film Festival. In Search of White Crows involves the lives of two sisters who on March 31st, 1845, claimed to be able to communicate with the spirit of a dead man who they believed had been murdered and buried in the cellar of their house. This revelation gave rise to what is now known as the birth of the Modern Spiritualism Movement. So buckle up, sit back and relax, and enjoy In Search of White Crows, the strange and tragic lives of the Fox Sisters.
Here, Mr. Splitfoot. Do as I do. Oh, Mother, he can see! Oh, Mother, he can hear!
The strange sounds began shortly after a foot peddler called on the Bell household. It was my impression that Mrs. Bell knew the peddler by the way they spoke to one another. The peddler wore a black frock coat, light-colored pants, and a black hat. He carried a peddler's trunk. That very same day, Mrs. Bell discharged me without an explanation. Before I left, I asked the peddler to stop off at my father's house, as I knew he would be interested in some of his goods. I always thought it strange that he never showed up. Several days later, Mrs. Bell called on me to inquire if I would be willing to return to her employ. I agreed, as I needed the money. When I arrived back in her home, I noticed right away that several of the peddler's items were about the house, including his trunk. A few nights later, I began to hear rapping sounds. The following night, I heard what sounded like a man walking past the buttery and down the cellar stairs. I then heard someone shoveling dirt. A few days later, as I was walking through the house, I looked into the bedroom and saw a man. He stood facing me. He did not speak. He had on a black frock coat, grey pants, and a black hat, just like the peddler wore. I became very frightened, as I knew no one had come into the house. I went to get Mrs. Bell, and when we returned, the man had disappeared. I was never able to ascertain who or what it was.
We rented the cottage about a year ago, after the Bell family had moved out. Although there was always something peculiar about the place, we didn't begin hearing the strange noises until about a fortnight ago. It sounded like someone knocking in the east bedroom. The first night we heard the rappings, we all got up, lit a candle, and searched the house, but we didn't find anything unusual. The noises continued to be heard every night. One day, just before evening prayers, I heard someone knocking on the front door. When I went to open it, no one was there. The next night, at about the same time, I heard someone knocking on the door again. I rushed to open it, and again, there wasn't anyone there. On Friday night, the 31st of March, we went to bed early and tried not to let the noises disturb us. Suddenly, we began to hear the rappings. Kate, the youngest, tried to make similar sounds by snapping her fingers. As fast as she made the noises, the sound made the same number of sounds. When she stopped, the sound stopped. I then spoke and said, "Count to 3," and it made 3 raps. I then asked if it was human, and no noise was made. I then asked if it was a spirit, and if so, to manifest it by 2 sounds. I then heard 2 sounds. I then asked if it was an injured spirit, and I heard rappings distinctly. I then asked if it was injured in the house, and it manifested yes by more noises. I then ascertained, after a while, that its remains were buried in the cellar. The spirit then responded that he had been a peddler who was murdered for his money and his goods. He had his throat cut with a butcher knife while in the same bedroom where we all slept.
Our family was originally from Rockland County, New York. Father was a blacksmith by trade, as his father before him. In 1811, he married our mother, Margaret, my namesake. Our older sister, Leah, was born in 1813, followed by Maria, Elizabeth, and David, our only brother. When the Erie Canal opened, our parents decided that their fortunes lay west, so they moved. When they got as far as Wayne County, New York, they settled in the small hamlet of Hydesville, located about 2 miles north of Newark. Shortly after their arrival in Hydesville, our parents separated. Mother said it was because of Father's taste for liquor and gambling, which she would not tolerate. They remained separated for almost 10 years, until Father transformed himself into a sober and serious man. He later became an observant Methodist and eventually served as the leader of his church. That's when Kate and I were born.
During the period when we first moved to Hydesville, revivalism swept through Western New York. Perhaps the greatest evangelist of them all, Charles Finney, came to Rochester and preached to thousands who traveled near and far just to hear his word. Reverend Finney referred to this area as the Burned Over District, so named because, since so many people had already become converted, there wasn't any fuel left for further conversions. The area had become burned over. Just within 20 miles of our home, the Mormon Church was founded by Joseph Smith. The Millerites formed the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The United Community was established near here, as well as the Shaker communities. There were also great migrations of Free Will Baptists, Pentecostals, Quakers, Presbyterians, and Methodists. They called it the Second Awakening.
During this same period, Rochester would also become the center for great social change. The origins of the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement were here. Most people don't know this, But the first anti-slavery speech ever given in the United States was delivered in Rochester. Why, Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony both became friends of ours. From these social and religious roots, Kate and I began to experience our spirit messages. Later, this was called the birth of modern spiritualism.
In the weeks following our initial contact with the spirit, hundreds of surrounding townspeople came to witness the sounds. Their wagons were parked all over the road, while scores of them peered into our house. Some of the curious went away awed. Others departed as they arrived, doubting. Soon, our older sister Leah arrived from Rochester. After speaking with Mother and Father, it was decided that I would go to live with Leah, believing that by separating me from Maggie, the noises would stop. They did not. Even as Leah and I went down the canal, the knockings followed us. The invisibles liked to visit their mortal friends. The noises continued through the autumn. Maggie and I became quite the sensation. We were now being investigated as to trickery, but none was found. Many others who heard the raps continued to grapple with their doubts, but only Maggie and I knew the truth.
When Kate and I arrived in Rochester, the spirits were overexcited and out of control. On our first night together, no sooner had I extinguished the light, Kate screamed. She said she felt a cold hand pass over her face and another over her shoulder and down her back. The disturbances continued almost until dawn. We finally fell asleep, but the next night brought renewed turmoil. Tables and everything in the room below us were being moved about. Doors were opened and shut, making the greatest possible noises. Then they walked upstairs and into the room next to us. There seemed to be many actors engaged in the performance and a large audience in attendance. We decided that day to abandon the house.
Soon after the Rochester disturbance, Leah rented another house where I went to visit. Soon after my arrival, the spirits began to demand that Kate and I share the truth of their immortality. They wanted us to perform in front of large crowds. At first, we resisted, wanting to spare ourselves from ridicule, but we were met by a roar that seemed to come from everywhere: the walls, the ceiling, and the floor.
You have a duty to perform. We want you to make this matter more public.
We could not deny them. With Leah's help, we rented the largest theater in Rochester, Corinthian Hall. The spirits were now in control. Supernatural visitation was in the air.
At first, I was astonished by the spirit's seeming ability to answer questions I asked out loud. And then amazingly, they even answered questions I asked mentally. I then resolved to test the spirits in another way, to see if my own mind was somehow having an influence on the matter. So I took a handful of shells, and without even knowing how many I took, I asked the spirits for the count. And still, the answer was correct. From these results, it is my opinion that whatever may be the origins of these rappings, the ladies in whose presence they occur do not make them.
From the moment Leah assumed direction of our appearance at Corinthian Hall, our lives changed. We were now under her will and the spirits. We began traveling to all the major cities to give additional performances. The public demanded it. We even lived in New York and London. We dined in the finest establishments. We wore the best of clothes. We met royalty and other notables. We married and had children. It was an exciting time. But we soon began to feel the strains of the constant investigation of our powers. We were accused of somehow using electricity and even ventriloquism to make the noises. We were even accused that the muscles and joints of our feet and toes were suspect in making the sounds. When Mother and Father died, it became worse for us. Soon after, Kate's husband died. Then the love of my life quickly followed. To deal with the anxieties, we turned to our father's weakness. Drink became more prominent in our lives, especially for poor Kate. We had always enjoyed the parties and the champagne, but soon it took control of our lives as the spirits once had. Leah had by then remarried into a very wealthy family and soon rejected us, just when we needed her the most. She was gone.
My estrangement with Maggie and Kate was very sad and something I will always regret. Maggie blamed me for her poor financial dealings, but it was I that made all of the appointments. I booked all the meetings. I organized all the readings. If it wasn't for me, she would have had nothing. And poor Kate, she began to deteriorate quite badly, and the children had to be cared for. What was I supposed to do? Allow them to live in their squalor? I could no longer live in their world. I had become a woman of substance. I had married well. I had a new life.
I had always believed that Maggie's confession was done to protect me. When I tried to settle down, I found my drinking habits continued. I became more and more unable to control my impulses and my life. I confess that I even neglected my children by leaving them alone when I frequented the saloons. Eventually, my children were taken away from me. I became desperate. I would do anything to get them back. I loved them so. When Maggie attacked spiritualism and claimed that we were never able to talk with the spirits, it was to attack the years of spectacle and fraud. She denounced the rise of fake mediums and the fanatics who demanded spirits come to them in full form, to walk before them, to embrace them. Maggie also blamed Leah for manipulating us and using us in her exhibitions. I even proclaimed that the whole thing was humbug, and that we simply created the sounds with an apple tied to a string. A year later, Maggie recanted her confession. She said strong psychological forces caused her to become unduly influenced by those who oppose spiritualism, and to spare me separation from my children, and by so doing subjected herself to great shame. That was Maggie's bargain. My dear Maggie.
On November 1st, 1890, Leah died at her home in New York City. According to her death certificate, she had died from an inflammation of the heart. Her age was listed as 76. We never reunited. A few months later, Kate returned from Europe, but quickly dropped out of sight. She had moved and left no forwarding address. In February of 1892, Kate returned to her home in New York, where, according to her friends, she had taken to drinking daily, and her health began to fail. A month later, we were informed that Kate had died. She was only 53. At the time of Kate's death, I was not doing very well. I was without funds and living in an apartment loaned to me by a great friend. On March 4th, 1893, I became very ill and was moved to the home of another loyal friend. A few hours before dawn, at 4:30 a.m. on March 8th, 1893, at the age of 59, I died. I went peacefully, without a struggle. I was buried next to my sister Kate, together in death as in life.
In 1904, 10 years after the death of Maggie Fox, and 56 years after the rapping sounds were first heard, the southeast portion of the cellar wall collapsed in the old Fox cottage. Upon investigating the cause, it was determined that an underground spring had slowly eroded and weakened the wall, whereupon a startling discovery was made. The collapsed wall had been, in reality, a false wall, built years after the original cottage had been constructed. Incredibly, found hidden behind the wall was a fully intact human skeleton, and lying next to the skeleton was a peddler's trunk.
I asked these spirits if I was seeing them, or if I was seeing what was in my own brain. They answered, both.